Okay, good day to the House at large. The motion brought forward for today's debate is that this House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of sovereign referenda to decide on important issues. So, which we are the government for. So, the government defines the topic as sovereign referenda. Citizens of a country will vote for every decision that affects them. So, the burden of proof today, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is actually a net benefit to society as a whole, in the short term and the long term, ladies and gentlemen. My two main issues are majority rules and accountability. Under accountability, I will be speaking to you about how this decreases crime and how this leads to a better state. So, without further ado, I'd like to go on to my positive matter, ladies and gentlemen. But before I go on to that, what is sovereign referenda? Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are not saying that the parliament should, or the government does not have a say in the running of the country. What we are saying here is that the government will have a say, but also, as people of the country, their decisions should be taken into account. Their ideas should be taken to a certain extent, ladies and gentlemen, as the decisions that are made directly affect them, as they are the people of the country. So shouldn't they, as the people of the country, have a say in what decisions are made in the running of this country, ladies and gentlemen? So on to my first point, which is majority rules. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is... No, thank you, sir. So, majority rules, ladies and gentlemen. Government is mostly made up of, what, say 60 members. Majority, or should I say a country, is made up of, what, 200 million people? Or maybe not so much, but say 5 million people. If you weigh out the pros and cons of that, 5 million people's votes are way more than 60 people of parliament, ladies and gentlemen. 60 people of parliament could all be corrupt, or maybe some may be corrupt. So how do you get a fair decision here, ladies and gentlemen? How do you get a decision made that will benefit society to its highest outcome, ladies and gentlemen? Whereas if it is opened up to the public and to the people of the country, then they are allowed to give in their views on the problem. They are able to vote on what they want of the country, and they are able to maybe gain what they want. Yes, sir.
So is the referendum in your policy legally binding or not?
No, sir. Yes, sir. It is legally binding, as the referenda will have what the referenda decides. If majority, then it should go, because these are the people of the country. Majority rules. That's my point, sir. So it is definitely legally binding. So, ladies, and on that point, sir, nobody is going to want a country that is not going to be beneficial to them. Who is actually going to say, okay, fine, we should ban all cars in the country? Nobody is actually going to say something like that, for example. So, if they all vote on something like that, they will all vote for the best of their benefit, and that is how we know that in practical states, they will vote for something that is liable and something that is relatively logical, sir. Back to my point of majority rules, ladies and gentlemen. If everybody gets a vote, if everybody has a say, then they are all now accountable for what is decided, ladies and gentlemen. So definitely, if they all vote, then they cannot complain after that, because they came up with the idea or the decision, and they were asked to vote. So if you vote, you should also be held accountable for this. So this, under my point of accountability, ladies and gentlemen, the government is not held fully accountable for this, because the government have opened it up to the community or to the society, and the society's input was taken in consideration very vastly, because definitely majority rules here, majority votes, they will definitely go with what majority says. So, on those terms, definitely the accountability is on a par. The seesaw is level. So, as we see, the country will run smooth there. Then, under the point of accountability, this decreases crime in the government. Yes, definitely, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, sir. Corruption on governance is at its highest. For example, South Africa. The government of South Africa is governing the society in a very bad way. There's so much of corruption. So what we are saying is, if we have a sovereign referenda in South Africa, which is a third world country, if we have a sovereign referenda in South Africa, we all have a say. We all have an input into what we want. We all have an input into what makes our lives better. We are the people of the country. We are paying taxes. We pay taxes for a certain reason. We are not paying taxes, for example, for you to be smuggled and to be put into back pockets of politicians, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we are saying with the sovereign referenda, crime is decreased, because now decisions are taken as a whole. Decisions concerning a country is taken as a whole, because the people of the country are making the decision with the government, which then leads to crime be decreased, because everybody is making the decision, and there won't be any leverage for government to go into crime, ladies and gentlemen. This leads to a better state, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how does this lead to a better state? If there is no corruption amongst politicians, then they can actually do what they are there to do. They are not trying to smuggle. They are not trying to go ride the people of the country the wrong way. They are not trying to benefit themselves only, but they are actually trying to benefit everybody of the country as a whole. Go please, sir.
But didn't the majority of Germany in the history actually agree to follow the Hitler regime?
Yes, sir. They agreed to follow the, assuming but not conceding that they did go ahead and follow the Hitler regime. But what we did see is, after Hitler did not tell them that he's going to be killing everybody. That is not the Aryan race. Hitler didn't tell them that. He just said he wants a pure race. After that, everybody was like, yes, we all want a pure race. We will vote for Hitler. Everybody voted for Hitler. When Hitler went wrong, what happened to Hitler? His whole Aryan race and everything that was behind him started to fall. Yes, it took generations, but what happened? It is no more going. Why, ladies and gentlemen? The people of the country and the generations fought for this to fall, and it did fall. So there, your point also falls, sir. And in terms of a better state, ladies and gentlemen, if there's no corruption, the government can do their job to the best of their ability. They can provide for the people of the country. People of the country can be happy. They are not now. They are actually wanting to stay into the country instead of going out of the country, ladies and gentlemen. So what have I proven to you today? I've told you that the I've spoken to you about the accountability of having a sovereign referenda. I've spoke to you about how majority rules and what they decide will really benefit the country as a whole. And I've also told you how accountability leads to a decrease of crime in parliament and politicians, and how it betters the state. So that is why I beg you to propose. Thank you.
I welcome the first speaker of the opposition, the Oslo.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to our own team case and our explanation of our arguments, I'd like to first make refutation against team propositions of first two arguments, and then move on to my own case. Now, the first argument was how majority rules, which we totally agree with. We think that the majority rules, which is the exact reason why the majority rules, and the majority of the citizens voted for the parliament, and the parliamentary members, the majority of them vote for something in the status quo. That's the exact system. So the majority who elected for the parliament, so their decision is not mutually exclusive. we do not see how T population could prove how these decisions could be mutually exclusive or going directly against each other while they were voted upon and elected by the majority of the people. Additionally, because these people also have personal interests as parliamentary members, they want to get re-elected and they have political interests. This is exactly the reason why this blocks further corruption. This is exactly the reason why, because they want to get re-elected, they mostly follow the correct decisions and the majority opinions of the people, unless it's significantly harmful for the nation.
So,
well, thank you, sir. Secondly, we want to say it's inefficient how they told us that in the definition that they want to vote on all the important issues, which we believe is very irresponsible government. We don't see how that's a form of indirect democracy. I think we thought that they were proposing for direct democracy in the case, which we believe is inefficient and impractical.
Right, sir.
Last but to say, thank you, sir, that we'll have to ask them to clarify what is exactly important issues that they're suggesting. Anything could be important if it's related to citizens, which is exactly the reason why we think it's arbitrary. Second, we'll have to ask them to clarify to what extent do they make the referendum take into account? Because firstly, they told us in their definition that they will take it into account to a certain extent, and then they told us that suddenly they'll because of our POI, they told us that they will have legal binding power. We don't see any to which exact extent can this referendum be taken into account. Is it definitive or not? We'll have to ask Team Proposition for a clear definition. And to the second argument of accountability, let's say firstly about corruption. Let's say that's a problem of corruption, because if there's a nation that has corruption, it has oppression, it has dictatorship, let's just say sovereign referenda will not solve this case, but investment. If you already have corruption, if you already have a government that's oppressing you and has a dictatorship, you don't see how there can be a proper sovereign referenda that guarantees the citizens that there will be no corrupt election in that case. Yes, sir.
So, but we're speaking about democracy, parliamentary democracy, not dictatorship, so.
Well, you told us in our case, you told us in our case is that you gave us an example of democracy that was corrupt, which sometimes had a dictatorship, which is exactly the reason why you have to say, if you made an example of that case, we would like to tell them to answer it in the case when they had an example of that case, ladies and gentlemen. If they had an example of corrupt democracy, let's say you have to answer an example of corrupt democracy. And through a point of information about Hitler, they told us that through the process of the history with the referenda, with the elections and referenda, they could finally get rid of Hitler's regime and etc. Let's say the only thing we can take account from that opinion was that they're justifying their action and saying that so at the end they have a utilitarian view. No, thank you, sir. They have a utilitarian view. They say that at the end Hitler was caught and put off. He was cut off and he was executed. So they say that it's justified. We don't see any justifiable point in that case. No, thank you, sir. And the only thing we can see from that case is that they're saying that although Holocaust did happen, it was because it was the majority rule and Hitler was eventually cut off. No, thank you, sir. They're saying that was not. Oh, stop rapping. No, thank you. No, thank you, ma'am. But the only thing we can think is that they're saying that if it is the majority, then they can accept anything, ladies and gentlemen. And last but to say, because the majority of people, wait a moment now, they elected the parliament, so they make the right decisions to get re-elected, or because they represent the opinions of the citizens, they are able to represent them best because they have been elected by the majority, as said by the population. Yes, ma'am.
In the case of Hitler, we see that the Nazis were in fact the minority and they were the only ones who were allowed to vote. The majority weren't. So can you please explain that? Actually,
in that case, you have admitted, your Team Population's Prime Minister admitted when we gave report information that most of the citizens, the majority of the citizens, agreed to take Hitler as the leader in that. He said that Hitler, everybody was saying that, we should have Hitler. That was almost exactly what he said. And we think that when that was already admitted by the Prime Minister, we don't see any point in raising a question that is opposing to a Prime Minister's statements themselves. We have three arguments to bring upon in Team Opposition's case today. Firstly, about how it undermines national stability. And secondly, about the backlashes of this policy. And lastly, about the oppression of the minority. The first and second arguments will be explained by myself, and the third argument of oppression of minority will be elaborated on by your opposition. I'll have to move on to a first argument of undermining national stability. We'll have to divide it into two parts of irrational citizens and populism. Well, to go on to the first part, well, ladies and gentlemen, when you have national voting or sovereign referenda, this means that the citizens can vote, all the citizens get to vote, which means that when the majority of citizens are mad at one matter, when they become a mob, when they form a mob, when they become irrational citizens, this means that this opinion is directly taken into account. And we could clearly experience how irrational behavior of majority of the citizens can be very detrimental and harmful with the London riots recently. And so the sovereign referenda can be a way for citizens to decide irresponsibly or irrationally upon matters. So when they say, and let's just say that the nation loses stability when it completely subjects itself to the voting of people who may be irrational in that case because they are directly harmed or benefited, no thank you sir, by these decisions, ladies and gentlemen, as was the definition of the important issues. Let's just say that a parliamentary democracy is a system when citizens delegate some of their rights to the specialists. So citizens delegate some of their rights to bodily autonomy to the specialists called doctors because they believe that they will have to do their best for them. It's the same thing for politics. They delegate their rights to politics in some cases of these important issues because they believe that the specialists, the politicians in the parliament, are able to make better decisions for themselves. And so let's just say that when these specialists are trusted upon, let's just say, why is team population suggesting that these specialists are people who cannot be trusted when there's many important issues that are just too sophisticated for these normal people to decide upon themselves? That's exactly why they delegated their political rights to these politicians. For example, when there was a United States-Korea FTA agreement, it was more than 1,000 pages of legal documents that needed to be made and read and understood by the parliament. We don't see how that can be done by the people when they make a sovereign referenda. That will just be too much of a burden for these people. No, thank you, sir. We recognize the fact that it will be a very undermining national stability when we take this into account. And the second point of this argument is about populism. As we have explained before, Hitler and Mussolini, they made populist policy. Hitler said, we can improve this national economic crisis just by getting debt from all over the world and then making the war, and then he said that then we can pay back all the money, which was irrational, but it sounded good to the Germans somehow, and he got the votes of the majority of the Germans. And that's how he got elected. Let us say this can also greatly undermine national stability because our votership, because this can be made by irrational decisions of the citizens and make populist policies. Now to move on to the second argument of backlashes, let's just say that firstly there's a backlash of accountability because when you have people to take into account and to fault when in the parliament, fault these politicians when they make the wrong decisions, they're the ones who feel responsible. But if there's the majority of the citizens who voted on the wrong issue, we see that you can't take anybody into account, and therefore nobody feels responsible for it. Secondly, about efficiency, when there's important urgent issues such as economic issues or war, let's say for example, Turkey has national referenda, and there's an average of 6 months that takes for a referenda to happen and take into place. So we say it's very inefficient for these citizens to vote and take 6 months of the time when the issue of war and economic crisis is in place. So it's harmful since the response to a national crisis or international crisis is very slow, and that's exactly the reason why I beg to oppose it. Thank you very much.
I welcome the second speaker.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're seeing from side opposition is that what the government says does in fact go. They're not considering the impacts of the decisions made and how unhappy the people are, ladies and gentlemen. They firmly believe that the government is always right, what the government says should go all of the time, and we should just ignore what the people feel or think, ladies and gentlemen. And let me just tell you, unhappy people makes an unhappy country. If the country is unhappy, there's going to be instability, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm going to go straight into my rebuttal, and we see that side opposition brought up the whole point of Hitler, but what we see that they have failed to understand that in the case of Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, the Nazis were in fact the minority. the majority of the citizens were ignored simply because Hitler had ensured that they weren't given the right to vote, they weren't given the right to make political decisions, and that is why it was such an extreme case, ladies and gentlemen. That is why there was so much of the negative impacts when it came to Hitler, ladies and gentlemen. You see that the majority weren't favored, and when the majority isn't favored, there's so many ripple effects, and there's so many detriments, and that in itself shows that the majority needs to be listened to, and the majority's voices need to be taken into consideration. So that point definitely doesn't stand in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen. They then mentioned that there won't be any corruption within government because political parties want to win votes from the people and they want to remain in power. But we see that this isn't true. Like my speaker has given an example of South Africa, the country that we come from. There is so much of corruption in government simply because the government doesn't care. The people don't have much of a say because there isn't sovereign referenda, ladies and gentlemen. All we can do is vote for a political party, they pass laws, they make the decisions, ladies and gentlemen, and we have no say whatsoever about it. We cannot say, you know, we do not agree with this law. It's just like an example would be the Protection of Information Law, ladies and gentlemen. That includes censoring the media. We do not agree with that. We want to know what's happening, what's going on in Parliament, but the truth is we have no say about it. That also makes the people happy, and that is also a detriment. That's why we see that sovereign referendum will in fact be the option. If people were given the option to vote, and yes, we were in fact voted out by the people, then yes, we will accept it and we will step back, ladies and gentlemen, and that will be fine. So that point also doesn't understand. Then there was the whole issue of national stability, which the first speaker brought up. And he said that, you know, there's going to be irrational behavior by the public. Now we see that this is a very, this assumption is quite absurd, ladies and gentlemen, because simply because the citizens would not behave irrationally if there wasn't something going wrong. If the citizens are mad about something, then yes, they're going to take up action about it. But no one's just going to pass all these crazy laws and behave irrationally towards the government just because they can, ladies and gentlemen. The citizens also want what's best for the country, and we see that side opposition really need to understand that no one's going to do something that's going to detriment them themselves. They're going to pass laws that's going to benefit them, that's going to benefit their families, the country, and the government, ladies and gentlemen. We also see that referendums are inclusive in the motion, ladies and gentlemen. We are not saying that everything voted for is going to be passed. The government is going to consider each option. Something which is ridiculous isn't going to be put into place, ladies and gentlemen. And we see that if the people aren't able to make the decisions, they're going to be unhappy, and that's going to lead to instability. That's going to lead to irrational behavior. If you're not going to be given a say, that's when you're going to behave irrationally. That's when there's going to be instability. So that whole point of national stability doesn't really stand at all. And I'm going to give you an example of this. An example of this is apartheid, which everyone really knows about, ladies and gentlemen. Apartheid was terrible. The citizens suffered. The majority of Africans weren't given the right to vote, ladies and gentlemen. It was the minority who was able to vote all of the time. And what was the impact of that on the country, ladies and gentlemen? We see that what really happened was the country was sanctioned. They weren't allowed to participate in many sports. Trade was stopped, ladies and gentlemen. That overall detriment to the country. Hence, we see that these sovereign referendums would in fact be a benefit, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll close my rebuttal and move on to my positive matter, ladies and gentlemen. My first point being rules to facilitators. You see that if we have sovereign referendums, the government becomes more accountable, as my first speaker has mentioned. You see that they will have to listen to the people, and they cannot do what they want. If they are listening to the people, there won't be room for corruption, like I mentioned, and they can't really do what they want. Then we see that because of this, the government would be more strategic and more efficient. If they are more strategic and more efficient, it's only going to be beneficial, ladies and gentlemen, because they're not going to want the public to vote on everything. then we see that this is also crucial in society, and we see that sovereign referenda allows for increase in pressure of the government, and this allows for more appropriate behavior within the government, ladies and gentlemen. And that closes my point on rules to facilitators. I then move on to my second point, which is the responsibility of the people. Now we see that the people, if people make decisions, they cannot go back and then blame the government for the decisions that they have made, which is in fact a benefit, ladies and gentlemen, because they're going to have to be accountable for what they said, and they're going to have to be responsible. Now, because they can't blame the government for the decisions that they have made, they're going to accept the responsibility of what they've done, and they're going to learn from this, and hence they're going to change and make appropriate decisions the next time, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, sir. You see that people will be politically inclined. At the moment, you find people don't really vote for a person, but they vote for a political party. They're not really involved in politics. The only time people are really involved in politics is during elections. Now, this is what we want to avoid. We want the people to be involved in politics so that they do in fact become politically inclined. People are politically inclined. They know what's going on with their government. They know what's happening within the country, and this is only going to be beneficial to everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Then we see that when people are constantly involved, it's better to have the majority vote, because decisions won't be biased. Yes, sir.
If the current parliament isn't doing well, and the citizens obviously are mad, won't they make sure that that same parliament isn't elected? Why is that the case with South Africa then?
You see, the problem with South Africa, is, in your example, is that in South Africa, people don't really vote for an actual leader. They vote for a political party due to the background and what they've been through before, ladies and gentlemen. You see, they won't really vote for the opposing party because of all the problems that the opposing party has caused before. And we also see that because of their lack of involvement in politics, they don't really understand. By getting them involved in politics, they understand it more, and they'll be able to vote for the right parties and make the appropriate decisions if they're involved more. That's what we are trying to say, sir. And then on to my last point, which is efficacy. We see that it decreases the amount of political parties by having people voting. And we see that you will have a few set political parties which will be favored by the majority. Now, why this is efficient is because of the amount of money that is put into political parties. Instead of spending so much of funds on so many parties, we're going to focus on a few parties, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to benefit the economy. By focusing on a few parties, these few parties with a greater capacity and greater sum of money can therefore do more for the public, and this is going to be beneficial as well, ladies and gentlemen. We see that there is no need for so many parties. There is no need to pay so many people such large lump sums of salary, ladies and gentlemen. If the economy benefits, it's going to be good overall. I thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a government team that basically proposes that we have a direct democracy. They say that because we have corrupt governments, they say because our government politicians cannot represent ourselves, we should vote for every issue that affect them. We think this is very impractical. And they're basically going against this whole idea of where we select politicians who know more about these issues, complicated issues, than the citizens, and those politicians choose best for the nation. We think that assuming that all of these individuals know best for the nation and all of these individuals can make rational decisions was a clear assumption that wasn't really proved by team government. Now, going on to the more specific rebuttals against them before our last argument of oppression of minority. We like to firstly state that they've never responded to our questions against their policy. They've told us that important issues kind of mean every decision that affects them. Then we really don't know why we have a government in the first place. Because every decision, every policy is going to affect the citizen. That's why they are called policies in a nation. Then if then following their standard, then every decision, every policies are going to be put into a voting, which we believe is very impractical and is too costly. Not only is this impractical and costly, we think that this has no meaning, because once citizens have to vote for everything that affects them, then we see that they're going to have a lot of then there's going to be a lot of cases where these citizens simply don't try to go to vote because they have a lot of other things to do. We say that even in nations like Korea or other democratic nations like the US, the reason why the voting rate is so low is because citizens feel lazy and citizens feel that they have other things, more important things to do. Then under their policy, because the citizens now have to vote for every policy, they will probably have to vote for like more than like 100 times a year, which we believe that citizens will start losing their interest in these policies, and these citizens will not be able to do that in the first place. So we think that a lot of citizens, so these decisions, the results of these referenda will be only based on the citizens, only on the few citizens who actually vote, which we don't really think is representing the whole democracy, and which we don't think is really representing the majority of their case, which is really contradictory to all of their arguments about how they think majority should rule our society. And also, we had a major point from the government saying that because we have corrupt governments, we should leave these decisions to individuals. Now, we have 2 points of rebuttals. Firstly, again, why do we have governments in the first place if we cannot trust them? Why don't we all decide every issue on ourselves because all of the governments are corrupt and all of the government officials only choose for their own interests? Yes, sir.
So even if we have to decide every single issue, we still need a facilitator, which is what the government's role is going to become.
Yes, sir. Then we believe that those facility issues, we say, are not really going to be built if those government officials are so corrupt that they want to actually benefit themselves. We think that all of these things are not going to be viable once you lose trust in the government officials thinking that they're so corrupt. And secondly, we say, if these government officials are so corrupt that you cannot trust them to make decisions for their interest, then how can we trust these sovereign referendums will be the results of these sovereign referendums will be accounted fairly to the actual decisions? We think that once you assume that such a corrupt government exists, and once you generalize that all of the nations we're talking about are so corrupt, then we say that these corrupt governments can simply fake and simply change the results of the majority, because it is the government who actually reveals these results of sovereign referendums, and it's not the individuals who do this. So thank you. And we had this argument about South Africa, where they have such a corrupt government, and they have these policies like accuracy. We think that this era where they're talking about accuracy was actually not a democratic government. And we also think that even though South Africa is so corrupt right now, we think that they're only focusing on the very minority of the parliamentary democracies that exist. We think that not every parliamentary democracy is as corrupt as them. And we think that in most cases, because we have other systems like re-election, these government officials, even though they might have the natural instinct to make more money, they have to defend their citizens if they want to get re-elected. And then there was this also another point about how there can be cases where so few parties exist. But we think that their example of 2 parties was also a very minority case. And we also think that if all of these parties that exist, all of these 2 parties exist, really don't defend the citizens' interests, and if they don't really, if they only benefit themselves, then we think that it is natural that another party, another group of people will rise as a political party, because if that's the case, then that party will actually gain the interest and the popularity of the people instantaneously. So we think that it was a total assumption that all of these parties existing in one nation is so corrupt, and no party can defend the nation. Yes, sir.
So if you care so much about the people's interests, then shouldn't their interests be taken into account in a via voting for this?
Yes, sir. We already know that you said that the majority is important, but we tell you that it is simply not true, that it simply cannot be put into practice, that all of these decisions can be put into voting. And we also say that our first speaker has already told you why the majority deciding on these issues might not be the best decision. We say that from the past we have seen many cases where the majority's decisions have not been the best, and how the majority only pursued their self-interest, especially short-term interests, because they don't have such wide perspectives as these politicians. And we've also told you how, because these majority citizens are not experts on these issues, complicated issues like entering into EU, or complicated issues like FTA might not really be handled really well for the citizens. We think that their example of banning all cars was really not in the scope of this issue, because we think policies and really important issues are much more complicated than that. They have to prove why letting the majority choose for every single issue will actually benefit the nation. We think that because all individual citizens really want to represent their own individual benefits that are really short-sighted. We're saying that these conflict of interest will not really lead us to the best decision. As in, the politicians who are much more expert and who really care for a lot more people because they want to get re-elected, these politicians will vote and choose a more accurate and more beneficial decision for all of the nations. Now, going on to our last point about the oppression of the minority, we think that once we put an important issue to the hands of the citizens, the minority will completely lose their power. We think that their argument about the majority being so important really is an oppression of the minority, because in a democratic society and in every society we think that minorities' interests should always be considered. But in this case, if we put every single issue in the hands of the majority, then it will be the majority who only benefits, and the minority will be always put at the cost of the harms of these policies. And we think that unless sovereign referenda, we say leaving this to the parliament, it will actually give better opportunities and chances, because every region has different interests and they select their own different politicians. So these politicians, if they want to get re-elected by their region, then we think that these politicians actually do represent the interests of these regions, and therefore these interests are also reflected in the parliament and the whole party's decision. And that's why we think we have a better representation of the minority, rather than the case of the majority, where the minority will be always at the cause of these harms. Thank you.
Now it's time for the propositions and not to speak.
Good evening, the House at large. In today's debate, we basically had an opposition that spoke to us about the status quo. They failed to show us why the status quo was better than referenda, and failed to recognize that all we're doing is improving the status quo, which is wanting a majority rule. I'm going to be dealing with a few issues here, which is one, role of government, oppression of minority, political inclination, and efficacy. Firstly, I'll go on to oppression of minority, because I felt that was a really small and an issue with not much substantial matter. So we see that even without a referendum, we see that the minority's needs and interests will always not be met. It's simply impractical to say that in a democracy that the minority's interests are going to be met. It's not something that carries any weight in this debate, because with or without the referendum, the minority needs are not met. Unless the government takes them and put them on a little island and then meet their needs there, then there's no other way to meet them. Because we see in a country of democracy, majority will always rule with or without the referenda. So I really don't see how the opposition could bring a minority point in here when in the status quo there still is a problem, because voting obviously isn't an absolute thing. So firstly, moving on to the thank you, sir. Moving on to the issue of the role of government. So firstly, what is the role of government in today's society with the status quo? The role of government is to make decisions that benefit the people. The role of government is to make the people happy and represent them. The role of government isn't to just go there and rule as a type of monarchy, ladies and gentlemen, because this is democracy. In a monarchy, we'll see that government will make decisions that they think, with a small group of limited minds and intellect, that they think is best for the country. But with the government and democratic government to add, we see that they'll have to make decisions that benefit the minority, which we have brought up. And we see they mentioned this whole issue of, you know what, people have the choice. They're voting the parties into power. Yes, that is true. They are voting the parties into power, but then we still need more decisions to be made. What's happening in countries, and the reason there's corruption in countries, not just South Africa, in most democratic countries, the reason being is because, yes, we vote them into power, and then they're stuck there making decisions by themselves. We don't have any say in the decisions that they make. So what we see is that, yes, on root level, we'll vote them into power, and then we'll help them make decisions. So then what happens here is that we need to make the decisions, but we also need to require facilitators. So the government will now change from a ruler into a facilitator and facilitate the issues, facilitate decisions in the country. And obviously, not every decision will be made solely on the majority rule, because what happens is that it's inclusive in their decision making. So they'll take the majority rule into account when making decisions. Obviously, something totally ludicrous wouldn't be implemented. So we see that this will ultimately increase the efficacy of the government and of their role, and help them to fulfill their mandate, because ultimately they're there to please the people. And if the people's, I'll take it in a minute, sir, and if the people's needs are met, then the people's needs, then the people will be happy. Yes, sir.
Sovereign referendum, you shouldn't talk about corrupt governments when corrupt governments can always use sovereign referendum for their own benefits if they're already corrupt, because they can always change the result of the sovereign referendum.
So, but you see, I don't see how they change the results of sovereign referendum, because the people are voting. They can't change. They can't change the results of that, because you see what happens in sovereign referenda is where there's a decision that needs to be made. They allow the country to say, okay, we're serving you. What do you want? And then those people are allowed to vote, and then they make their decisions. You see, there's no way that corrupt governments will become more corrupt. No, thank you, sit down, sirs. You see that, yes, governments are corrupt, but without referenda, then corruption increases. But rather with referenda, we see that corruption can ultimately decrease, because they're more accountable to the people and their decisions. So then, ultimately, this will make the government more effective. And yes, we see politicians are there. Politicians are the expertise to make decisions, but we see that politicians cannot make it solely alone, because the burden is too great. And what this does will decrease the burden on the politicians, helping them to fulfill a position of that magnitude. So closing up on the issue of the role of government and moving on to political inclination. Yes, we do concede to the fact that people vote, people see them make campaigns, people make decisions, but are these decisions actually what the people, what's in the best interest of the people? Because we see that what happens is here, people only vote during election time. They see the parties campaigning during election time. Their decisions are uninformed and not politically inclined, ladies and gentlemen. And how are we going to involve the citizens of the country more politically without having referenda? The opposition fails to recognize this point of political inclination and fails to show us any other way to make people politically inclined. So the whole issue of we vote them into power doesn't really stand here, because they're voting them into power out of just compulsion, because they don't really know who to vote for, because they aren't really politically inclined. They aren't really paying attention to the politics of the country, because what they think isn't taken into account when the government makes decisions. So what we see is that if referenda is put into place, then I'll take it in a minute. If referenda is taken into place, then it requires people to pay attention to what the government is actually doing. It requires people to be more politically inclined, making better decisions, and even for the next elections, they'll actually a party, because now they are more politically inclined. They know what the government's doing. They know how they operate. Yes, sir.
I believe the average citizen of a nation can actually have an informed decision if you have to vote 100 times a year about sophisticated issues like the FTA.
Well, so looking at the average citizen, maybe not every single person is going to vote, but what we see is those people who want to actually vote would actually now have a say, whereas before they didn't have any say at all. All they did is stare at the television screen, looking and be like, okay, I have no say, I can't do anything about this, even though I have a lot to say. And the average citizen will also be affected, because now he says, wait, all these people get to decide in making these decisions, maybe now I should pay attention so I can also make a decision, because now it's affecting me. Whereas before, my decisions didn't matter, so I don't need to care about politics, because what I choose doesn't really matter. So we see that, no thank you sir, so we see that the whole issue of political inclination actually will benefit the status quo, because decisions will be made with more accurately, ladies and gentlemen. So we see we need to get people more politically inclined, and this is the only way. So we see that the opposition gave no really alternative to get people more politically involved without having this referendum. So it's no thank you sir. So we see lastly on that issue of political inclination, the issue of citizens' interests, we see that we want citizens' interests to be met, not because they were harping on the fact that no, the interests of the majority, etc. And we see that the only way that the citizens' interests will be met is by giving them the choice to vote and be included in government's decisions. So closing on that issue and doing the last issue on efficacy, we see that it's better than the status quo. Currently we vote, uninformed one as I mentioned before, and we vote for the company put into place, and they do all the decisions making. And we see that not all the time do these politicians know what the people want best. The only way that we can find out what the people want best is by allowing them to vote for what they want best. So we see that it will improve the efficacy of decision making of the government, ultimately helping the government to perform its duty. And we see that this side of the house came with a lot of assumptions, saying that no, it won't be practical, for issues of corruption will still increase, and they didn't really give much substantive matter to that. All they did was spoke about the problems of the status quo. They didn't show how the status quo will be improved in any other way. They didn't show how the status quo will be worsened by referendum. All they did was spoke about the status quo. Yes, we agree 100% with what the situation of the status quo is, but all we're saying is that now we found a way to change the status quo for the better. Even if it's by 5% increase, it's still a change, it's still a benefit, it's still going to help society. So we see that it's going to benefit the nation ultimately. So what have I proven to you today? I've proven to you that yes, people vote parties into power, but we need more than voting parties into power. We need to focus on also the decision making, and we need to focus on removing the burden on politicians and helping them make better decisions that benefit the country. I've told you about oppressing the minority. Doesn't really stand in today's debate, because the minority will never get their needs ultimately met in democracy, because that's majority rule. And lastly, political inclination. There's no other way to get people more politically inclined besides a referenda. And lastly, on efficacy, we want an effective government, we want an effective nation, and ultimately we want everyone in the country to be happy. So for these reasons, the motion should most definitely stand. Thank you.
Now I welcome you to stand up. Back there.
Ladies and gentlemen, most honorable adjudicators, we have a team proposition today who basically has lost all trust to their government and all trust to the national parliament that they actually have voted with their own hands. And we say that they basically lied and basically have all of their whole case has basically has roots in the case of South Africa. We say that South Africa, yes, it is a democratic nation in the status quo. However, we say that this is not exactly a proper model that we can actually use as a standard democracy in the status quo, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speaker. And having said that, we now like to move on and explain to you about the three major clashes that we could find on team opposition today. Our first clash that we could find in today's debate was about the proficiency of the members of the national parliament. And the second clash that I'll be elaborating about is the effect of sovereign referenda on our society. And the third point of clash that I'd like to be talking about is the practicality of team proposition's policy in today's debate. Having said that, now let's move on and elaborate about, thank you sir, about our team's first clash, which is about the proficiency of the members of National Parliament. Now about two major points in this first clash. The first one will be about the fundamentals of indirect democracy. We believe that in a system under indirect democracy, which all of the nations in the whole world are actually selecting as a proper model, because all of the countries have decided that 5 million people, 50 million people having to vote for 100 different topics over 365 days is actually quite impractical. Most countries are selecting the form of indirect democracy, unlike what Team Population is doing in today's debate. And we believe that under a system of indirect democracy, we believe that giving trust to the elected members of the National Parliament is actually one of the fundamental keys of actually running an indirect democracy. And we believe that Team Population in today's debate simply came up and assumed that all people are simply corrupt, that all politicians cannot properly represent their people. And we have told Team Population clearly that these people will be elected out of office as soon as they start misrepresenting these people and not voicing themselves out in representation of the people that they actually represent. However, the only response that we've got from Team Population is that there are countries still existing, such as South Africa, is actually quite corrupt. But we believe that there are countries such as South Africa being caught in the status quo. But we believe that in that case, sovereign referenda will not solve anything under their government in power, and they only told us that sovereign referenda will be taken into consideration. Well, in that case, Madam Speaker, we believe that this will actually not solve anything, because the government is still the stakeholders of actually no, thank you, sir, or the people who are actually going to make the final decisions. We believe that their case will not solve anything at the end of the day. And the second point of this clash is about how there needs to be expertise and specialization in a society. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, and CEOs. Wait a moment, sir. These are all categories and these are all jobs of people who have actually studied for their lives to actually achieve this job. And we believe that this is actually exactly the same for the politicians that we see in the National Parliament. Yes, sir.
So you spoke about how the problem is that the party is still in play there. And how are we going to change things if people aren't politically inclined and they don't really care about politics, but they still vote?
Yes,
how are we going to change it?
Yes, we believe that, I'm going to mention this actually in my further classes, but we believe that in Team Population's policy, we believe that the political interest of the people will actually drop even more, because they have to start worrying about 100 different things per year. And we believe that this is actually not going to really increase the interest of the people when they have to be working at their hospital if he's a doctor, if she's a doctor. And we believe that they cannot actually take part in interest over 100 different issues a year. This is simply impractical in today's debate. And basically, moving on back into the second part of the first clash, we believe that the politicians are also experts who actually have mastered the field of politics. And we believe that we have to have trust in these people, or else we cannot have trust for any other members of society. We should not have trust for doctors, we should not have trust for the CEOs, we should not have trust for the lawyers, Madam Speaker. We believe that Team Population is basically working under the assumption that all of the basically that all members of society only work for their benefit and do not work for the society's benefit. We believe that this is not true, and this also stands for in the case of politicians. Now let's move on to our team's second clash, which is about the effects of sovereign referenda in a society. No, thank you, ma'am. I want to talk about two major points in this clash also. Well, the first point of this clash will be about the ineffectiveness and the sluggishness of the sovereign referenda itself. We believe that a nation can be a state at war, and it can also be a state of economic crisis. And we believe that in these kind of situations, where situations basically change from time to time, like in like another week, the economic crisis can actually shift from one period to another period. And we believe that in these cases, instantaneous response is actually required. And we believe that if we actually let these kind of matters go up to the hands of the citizens, and we believe that not only is there a problem of the lack of expertise in these citizens to decide upon these sophisticated issues, but secondly, we believe that the effectiveness of these of the voting issue is actually quite a problematic issue, because we believe that as we've already explained, the time that we take as in Turkey is actually averaging 6 months, because as they've explained, the government actually has to decide between the options, and there's actually final stakeholders. We believe that their policy that they've actually suggested actually changes nothing, but actually makes the situation more inefficient. And our second point of this clash is about how sovereign referenda actually has more of a misrepresentation of minority, because they've told us that in democracy, minority always gets sacrificed. But we believe that in the case of sovereign referenda, the case becomes even worse. Because we say that in a sovereign referenda, if, let's say out of 5 million people, 5,000 people vote on one issue, then if 2,501 people agree on one thing and 2,499 people oppose, then we believe that then the majority wins, and the 2,499 people cannot actually influence the policy. No, thank you, sir. And we believe that actually in a parliamentary democracy, there are many cases where a policy can actually be through the national parliament when they receive over 3/4 of the vote and things like that. And we believe that in such cases, minority can actually voice themselves out. Yes, sir.
So, but isn't it better if 51% of the people's needs are met rather than 100% being dissatisfied?
Well, we believe that 100% of people being dissatisfied is actually an assumption in the first place, because we believe that people who actually, people that they see in the newspapers, they basically believe that all the people do not agree to the decisions. Do not agree to the decisions of the national parliament because the opinions that the news and the media actually reports are the people who actually oppose. On the other hand, the people who propose do not really voice themselves out because they're actually satisfied with what the government is doing. We believe that the assumption that team population is making, how nobody will be satisfied, does not stand in today's debate. Now to move on to our third class, which is about the practicality. So the first point is that if the government still has an option under the team population policy, the problems such as corruption will not go away because the government still has an option. The government are the people who are actually going to decide. They're the people who actually have a final decision for themselves. Well, they told us they're going to take into consideration. They did not tell us exactly until what point they're going to take consideration, but they still believe in the existence of the government whatsoever. We believe that in such situations, the corruption will not go away if they, under the population's case, which they believe that corruption is going to exist in any time. No, thank you, sir. And the second point of this class is about the voting rate. We believe that if 5% of the people vote, we ask them, is this really a correct representation of the 100% of the people? Because we believe that it is quite difficult to reach a voting rate of 70–80% if there are 500 votes going on in 1 year. We actually say that this is quite impractical and inefficient and infeasible at the end of the day. And we believe that this will only bring harm to society and will only exacerbate the situation. Therefore, we would like to beg you to come. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's now time for the reply stages. I welcome the opposition reply speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you one question before moving on to the other key questions. What is the right or wrong decisions for the nation? Is that exactly same or corresponding to what the majority of the citizens want? For example, the majority of the citizens may not want something due to not being able to know the exact special effects of that policy. For example, the FTA policies. When the United States tried to sign the FTA policy with Korea, the majority of the citizens disagreed. After they signed it, there has been very good effects, and we have been getting benefits from that policy. So for the long term, or for the nation itself, it may be that the politicians will need to say something about this thing, about the matter, and say that we need this policy in the long term because it will bring in national benefits, and we know better because we are the specialists in this area, ladies and gentlemen. If we keep on following the majority of the citizens, we do not know what chaos it will bring because these citizens are not exactly the specialists in every field, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we have boiled this debate down to three key questions that both teams have mentioned and answered. Firstly, the point of majority and minority. Secondly, about government corruption. And lastly, about the efficiency of this policy. Now, briefly to the first point of the majority and minority. Now, PhD population only answered about the majority. They ignored the minority, and they said how majority rules in every case. Now, we team opposition told you, maintain that the majorities are the ones who vote for the parliament, and those who are voted on by the parliament are the ones who, and the majority of the parliament are the ones who decide upon these issues. So it is actually the absolute majority at the end of the day who decides upon the matter. And secondly, that it's impractical for everybody to vote, which wasn't answered by team population. And Also, the most important point is that it's not really a majority that votes when only the people who are interested actually vote. As mentioned by Key Population, who made a point of information, they said that, well, eventually the people who are interested will vote on this matter, which we take into account, and thanks for that point, that because only the people who are interested get to vote in sovereign referenda, because of the point raised by Tea Population, exactly that's the reason why it's not really the majority who decides on these issues. And also, we Tea Population answered both issues of majority and minority, that the majority are respected because the majority elects in parliament, and the minority are respected in the status quo, contrary to what the population claimed, because since the voters need the elections and the votes, they need to respect the minority. For example, the United States President Barack Obama was an advocate of the universal health care for the minority because he knew that he will get votes and he was going to be better off in the elections if he respected the minorities. And also for the regional minorities, they're represented better by the regional representatives in the parliamentary democracy system, which is the reason why we see in the status quo that minority is being represented very well. While we see in the sovereign referendum this will not happen because only the interested people will vote, and the majority or the minority, neither of them will be actually best represented under their system. And the second question was about government corruption. Well, population said that, with the example of South Africa, that they have corruption, and the sovereign referendum is going to solve it because the citizens get to decide. And lastly, that they gave us a surprising saying that most parliamentary democracies, they said, were corrupt, which we thought was preposterous. Not every, actually the majority of the governments actually are not corrupt. And not to say that we're going to give you an example of how the Korean dictators, two of them, actually used the sovereign referendum at that time, so that they could use that, alter the results, because they're the ones who announce the results, ladies and gentlemen, because it's done under secret election policies. Therefore, they changed the results, and therefore the problem of corruption was not solved. If we're going to talk about corrupt governments, we can't solve it by sovereign referenda. So the population did not give us any solvency upon the point of any corrupt governments. And thus, we give you a solvency because they will be afraid of the re-elections, and therefore they will be trying to go for the things that says it's wrong. And lastly, briefly about the efficiency. Tea Population didn't say really anything about the practicality or the efficiency, while we maintain that it's very inefficient. For example, Turkey, when they have sovereign referenda, it takes 6 months when they have to decide upon important issues like war and economic crisis, and also because these citizens are not specialists, they can't make 1,000-page legal documents. Ladies and gentlemen, they're not the responsible beings who can actually make the right decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the reason why we beg to oppose. Thank you very much.
Good day to the House at large once again. In both cases today, ladies and gentlemen, we see that minority is in favor. With sovereign referenda, the minority is at least given a chance to say, is at least given a say, which is better than no say at all, ladies and gentlemen. So, and so far we see, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, the opposition side has come up with the point of national stability. But we all see that the national stability will only occur when the whole country is in harmony. The whole country, the entire country will only be in harmony when everybody is happy. Everybody is happy only when all their ideas are heard and their accounts are taken into consideration, ladies and gentlemen. They gave a point of Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, but then we see that the Hitler regime was made of the minority, ladies and gentlemen. We see that we are focusing on majority. They keep harping on the point. They kept harping on the point that minority needs to be taken into account because they are also people of the country. But here we see that, ladies and gentlemen, if the minority doesn't vote, how does that affect the majority of the people? Would we rather have 100 votes being made and everybody being unhappy, or 100 votes being made and majority being happy, ladies and gentlemen? That is the question that this side of the House failed to answer, give us an answer today. We also see that the point of suppression of, we also see that political inclination was brought up into this debate. But we see here, the government can only prosper when the citizens of the country are happy and the citizens of the country are behind the government in the decisions that they take. But what we also see here, ladies and gentlemen, if the government gives the citizens a chance to help them make decisions. We are not saying that we are going to take away the government's job. We are not saying that the politicians will now be out of a job, as this side of the house implied, that they studied so long so they should do their job. They will be facilitating this. They are just taking in our considerations into account, ladies and gentlemen. We have also noted that this side of the house brought up the point of impracticality too late into this debate, because they brought it up in their third speaker speech. So what have we proven to you today, ladies and gentlemen? We've proven to you that if all vote, all will be in harmony. We've also told you that rules to facilitators. We've given you the point of rules to facilitators. We've given you a vast explanation on how citizens together with Parliament are accountable. This brings about harmony, because there is a fairness here, because everybody was asked to vote. If you don't vote, what do you expect the outcome to be? You cannot sit back and relax and say that no, this is wrong, that is wrong, that is wrong. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't vote when they are giving you a say, the minority can't be taken into account. Everybody needs to vote. Everybody needs to get up and do what they're supposed to do, so that majority can rule and will rule in the long term, ladies and gentlemen. We have explained thoroughly on how citizens should get more involved in politics, so that their understanding of what the side of the house said is more well known to them, or knowledgeable to them. And what other way to vote fairly if not everybody voting, ladies and gentlemen? That is what we are trying to say today, is that everybody should be given a chance in the country, and while if everybody is given a chance in the country, then voting will go well. We have also proved to you that it will benefit the citizens because it will be them voting. It's logical that these citizens are not going to vote for something that will not benefit them, ladies and gentlemen. They will definitely vote for something that will benefit them. So in the long term, this will benefit them, and having a sovereign referendum delegate in Parliament will definitely benefit them, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to let that go.
Thank you very much to everyone. You may now cross the floor, shake hands, and leave the room in order to let us make the 7th break.